Claire Hartwell stood on Red Lodge Valley's boardwalk in 1884, and the wind treated her like a stranger. Folks smiled at her, but their eyes kept counting what she couldn't give. A doctor had called her barren, and the word stuck to her dress like dust. Her fiancé left her in daylight, right outside the general store, so everyone could watch. He said it was Legacy Son's land, and he said it like prayer. The town agreed, because in that valley a woman's worth was measured in cradles. Claire learned to swallow shame the way a ranch hand swallows dust on a long drive. She kept working at Mr. Kessler's store, sweeping boards, balancing ledgers, pretending her heart was stone. Then the bell over the door rang hard, and the room went quiet like a church. A mountain man filled the doorway, buckskin and buffalo hide, eyes gray as coming weather. If you ride for stories like this, hit subscribe and keep your coffee hot. Quick check, friend. Are you breathing easy these days, or do stairs steal your wind? His name was Gideon Cross, and Red Lodge Valley spoke it the way you speak of fire. They said he lived high in the Bitterroot High Country, where pines creak and wolves argue all night. They said he trapped beaver-cut timber and came down only when his flour barrel went empty. They also said Winter had taken his wife Nora 3 years back and left him with 5 wild kids. Claire had heard the rumors the same way she heard her own name whispered, like a warning to stay small. But when Gideon stepped inside, he didn't look at the gossiping ladies first, he looked at her. Claire was stacking tins of peaches, and she kept stacking them, even as heat rose in her cheeks. Mabel Pruitt was near the flour barrels again, loud enough to be kind, cruel enough to sting. She told the other women that God closes some wombs for a reason, and they nodded like judges. Claire had learned not to answer, because answering only feeds people who live on other folks' pain. Still, the words hurt, and they hurt worse because they sounded final. 2 years earlier, scarlet fever had burned through her body, and Dr. Pettigrew had spoken like a verdict. He told Harlan Whitcomb, the banker who wanted sons and a big name, that Claire's future was empty ground. Harlan believed him because a man with money believes whoever protects his pride. He broke the engagement the next morning on the boardwalk, and he didn't even take off his gloves. Claire remembered the sound of his boots shifting, remembered how he couldn't meet her eyes. After that, she became a lesson. The town told its daughters, keep sweet, keep fertile, keep quiet. So she worked, and she saved pennies, and she tried not to look at baby blankets in the mercantile window. On the day Gideon walked in, the valley was already tasting winter, that sharp edge in the air. He carried a crumpled list, but he moved like a man who never trusted paper to keep him alive. Mr. Kessler tried to sound cheerful, and his voice came out thin as dry kindling. Gideon asked for flour, sugar, salt, coffee, and wool cloth enough to outlast a siege. While the order was filled, Gideon walked the aisle toward Claire, and the boards seemed to hold their breath. Up close, he looked carved by Weatherbeard, heavy knuckles, scarred coat, smelling of pine and smoke. Claire had seen rough men before, but this one carried a different kind of tired, like he hadn't slept in seasons. He tipped his hat just enough to be polite, and he spoke low so only she could hear. You, the woman they keep jawing about, he asked, not mocking, just steady. Claire lifted her chin because pride was all she had left, and she wouldn't hand it over. If you came to add your insults, she said, you can take a number and wait. A corner of Gideon's mouth moved, almost a smile, like he respected a woman who didn't fold. Insults don't keep a fire burning, he said, and I didn't ride down here to waste breath. He looked past her shoulder toward the window where the last sun was sliding behind the hills. Then he looked back at her, and Claire felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, being seen. Gideon took his supplies paid in pelts and coin, and instead of leaving town, he tied his team at the boarding house. That alone lit up the valley, because men like him didn't linger where rules and gossip lived. The next morning, Claire was sweeping the boardwalk, and she heard those boots behind her slow and sure. She turned broom in hand, and there he was without his hat, looking more like a man than a rumor. Miss Hartwell, he said, I'm a straight shooter, and I'll talk straight if you'll hear it. Claire tightened her grip on the broom handle, because every straight talk in her life had ended with her losing something. Say it then, she replied, and let the wind carry the rest. Gideon glanced toward the mountains, and his eyes went distant, like he was hearing a storm nobody else could hear. Winter's coming early, he said, and I've got 5 children on that ridge, and I can't do it alone. He named them Quiet Cole 13 and Furious Sadie 10 and already tired Luke 8 and mostly silent Annie and Sam 5 and Wild. Claire felt the broom go light in her hands because she heard need not pity in his voice. "If you're hiring a governess," she said, "you've picked the wrong woman. This town has made my body a public joke." Gideon's stare hardened, and for a moment he looked like the kind of man who could stop a fight by standing still. "I don't care what they call you," he said. "I heard it all, and it's foolish talk from safe mouths. I don't need you to give me children, Claire. I've already got more than I can hold together. I need a partner this winter, and I'm asking before snow seals the pass." Claire stared at Gideon Cross, and the boardwalk felt narrower than a coffin lid because every ear in Red Lodge Valley leaned closer. Gideon kept his hat crushed in his hands, and he spoke of the ridge as if it were a living thing, one that demanded order, warm food, and a woman's eye for danger. Claire asked why he would trust a woman the town called broken, and Gideon answered with a blunt nod toward Mabel Pruitt and her circle of nodding faces. Down the street, Harlan Whitcomb stepped out of the bank with his young wife on his arm, and Claire watched him laugh like he'd bought the whole valley. She told him yes, and the word surprised her more than it surprised him, because Gideon only exhaled once like he'd been holding his breath since Nora died. Pastor Boone kept wiping his palms on his coat, and he hissed that Claire was making a sinful bargain with a savage, a man unfit for church or family. Claire signed the registry with steady script, and she felt something warm rise in her chest. Not romance yet, just the simple relief of being defended in public. By sunset, she was Claire Cross, and she packed her life into one trunk, leaving behind a broom, a narrow room, and every sentence people had spoken over her head. They rolled out of town with the horses straining, and Claire didn't look back because she feared one last glance would turn her into the girl who waited for Harlan to return. On the first night, they camped near a stand of Ponderosa, and Claire learned how silence can be a kind of kindness, because Gideon kept watch while she slept under his fur-lined blanket. The second day, the trail narrowed and the wagon jolted over ruts and roots, and Claire's hands ached from gripping the rail, but she refused to complain. At dusk, they passed an old snare line, and Gideon showed her how to read tracks in thin snow, rabbit, fox, and something heavier that made him touch his rifle. On the third morning, the air thinned and the valley fell away behind them, and Claire saw the Bitterroot high country rise like a wall of dark teeth. Near noon, Gideon pointed to a narrow cut between rocks, and he told her that once they crossed it, there was no easy way back until spring. That afternoon, Gideon finally spoke of Nora, not with tears, but with the careful respect of a man setting a tool back on its peg. Claire answered that she wouldn't try to erase Nora, and Gideon's shoulders eased, because he feared bringing a new woman up there meant betraying the old one. Late that day, they reached the last stretch where wind came straight down the pass and stung Claire's eyes until they watered. When the cabin finally appeared, built tight against stone smoke, lifting from the chimney, Claire felt both relief and dread, because she was about to meet 5 grieving hearts at once. The door opened, and Sadie stood first with Annie and Sam pressed close, while Luke hovered back, and Cole stood on the porch with a rifle across his shoulder like a challenge. Claire stepped down into the mud, lifted her chin, and told herself this was the true beginning. Not the wedding, not the gossip, but the moment 5 hearts decided if she could stay. The cabin looked sturdy from a distance, but up close it felt like a place holding its breath. It leaned into the rock face, and the chimney stones were black with old smoke. A half-split woodpile sagged under snow, and tools lay scattered like they'd been dropped mid-thought. Bones from last season's game sat near the fence line, and ravens watched like they owned the yard. Claire stepped down from the wagon, and mud grabbed at her boots with greedy hands. Gideon didn't offer a speech, he just offered his palms steady as a hitching post. Cole stayed on the porch rifle, resting easy, eyes sharp enough to cut rope. Sadie held Sam's hand, and Annie hid behind her skirt, peeking out like a rabbit. Luke stood by the doorway, thin shoulders, hunched gaze fixed on the ground. Claire could feel 5 kinds of grief, and none of them knew her name yet. Gideon cleared his throat, and his voice carried across the yard like a command. "Children, gather in," he said, "and don't make me ask twice." They moved because they were used to his tone, not because they wanted to obey. "This here is Claire," Gideon said. "She's my wife now, and she's staying. You'll show her the same respect you show me," he said, "even when you're mad." The wind pushed through the pines, and the silence after his words felt heavy. Cole stepped forward, rifle still loose, and his jaw tightened like a vice. "She ain't our ma," Cole said. "Ma's buried under the willow, and that's the truth. We don't need a town lady," he added, coming up here to steal her place. Gideon's eyes flashed, and his shoulders rose like a bear about to stand. Claire lifted one hand, and she touched Gideon's sleeve, gentle but firm. She didn't look at the rifle. She looked at the boy behind it. "You're right, Cole," she said. "I'm not your mother, and I won't pretend. I won't touch her things," she added, not without asking, and not without respect. "But winter's coming," she said, "and winter doesn't care who we miss. It only cares if we eat," she said, "if we're warm, and if we stay alive. I don't expect love," she said, "but I do expect clean hands before supper. Now who's going to help me carry my trunk?" she asked, and she waited. Cole sneered and he turned away, muttering "Townie" like it was a curse. Sadie hesitated, then she stepped forward and her fingers closed on the handle. Inside the cabin hit Claire like a wall of stale grease, damp wool, and old smoke. The main room was big, and the hearth was built for real winters, not for show. Skillets were stacked on the table, and dried mud tracked across every board. A kettle sat empty, and the pantry shelves looked raided by desperation. Claire set her trunk down, and she let herself take one slow breath. She'd seen tidy houses, and she'd seen poor houses, but this was a grieving house. Sadie hovered near the stove, watching Claire's hands, watching her face. Kids always watch hands because hands either strike or hands keep you fed. Gideon hung his coat, then he pointed toward the back, eyes serious. "There's a cedar box," he said, "that was Nora's and nobody opens it." Claire nodded once and her voice stayed low, respectful as church. "I won't open it, Gideon," she said, "and I won't ask the children to forget." Gideon's shoulders eased a fraction and Claire saw the man under the mountain. He wasn't cruel, he was tired, and tired men fear losing what little remains. Claire rolled up her sleeves and she moved to the water bucket by the door. "First thing," she said, "we heat water and we wash up, all of us." Cole barked a laugh from the porch, and his boots thudded as he came inside. "You ain't the boss of me," he said, and his eyes dared her to break. Claire didn't raise her voice because shouting is what folks do when they're losing. "Then you can be cold and hungry on purpose," she said, "but you won't make the twins." Sam and Annie looked up at that and fear flickered, then hope followed behind it. Claire pointed to the basin and she kept her tone steady like law. "Hands first," she said, "then supper, then boots stay by the door, not by beds." Sadie moved fast, washing like she'd been waiting for permission to be a kid. Luke lingered, then he dipped his fingers quick as a fox, eyes still down. Cole stayed stiff, but when Gideon's gaze landed on him, he finally complied. Gideon didn't smile, but Claire noticed he watched her like he was learning her shape. Claire set beans to simmer, and she found flour, and she started rough bread. It wasn't fancy, but it smelled like a promise, and the cabin felt less empty. When they sat to eat, Cole shoved his bowl away, and he reached for jerky. Claire let him, because winning one meal wasn't the point. Surviving winter was. She spoke to the twins instead, and she asked their names like it mattered. Annie whispered hers, Sam echoed his, and their shoulders dropped as warmth spread. Claire asked Luke what he liked to do, and his lips moved, but no sound came. Sadie answered for him, soft and careful. He carves little things when he feels safe. Gideon's eyes narrowed at the word safe, as if it hurt and helped at once. After supper, Claire stood, and she pointed to the floor, calm as sunrise. "We clean the table," she said. "We sweep once, and we set tomorrow straight tonight." Cole scoffed, but he watched, and Claire could feel his anger looking for cracks. She swept anyway, and the broom sounded steady, like a clock starting again. That night the wind battered the walls, and the cabin creaked like an old wagon. The children slept in a back room, stacked close like pups in a den. Gideon set his rifle by the door, then he checked the latch twice. Habit, not fear. Claire sat near the hearth, and she mended a torn sleeve she'd found on Sadie. Gideon watched her needlework, and his voice came out rough, almost unsure. "You sure about this?" he asked, "because you can still turn back if you need." Claire looked at the fire, then at the shadows of 5 children breathing in sleep. "I turned back for 2 years, she said, "and it nearly killed me, slow as winter." Gideon nodded, and he stared into the flames like he was seeing old storms. Outside, the Bitterroot high country howled, and inside a new kind of order began. Claire woke before dawn, and the cabin still smelled sour. She boiled water, and the kettle sang against the hard cold. Gideon watched silently, and he didn't interrupt her steady rhythm. Claire set rules, and she wrote them inside her mind. Boots stayed by doors, and mud stayed outside on purpose. Hands got washed first, and supper came only after that. Cole tested her fast, and he tracked slush across boards. Claire didn't shout, and she pointed toward the rag bucket. You made the mess, Cole. You clean it tonight. Cole laughed sharp, and the twins flinched at his sound. Claire knelt by Annie, and she smoothed her tangled hair. Annie blinked hard, and she held tighter to Sam. Claire spoke soft, and she kept her eyes on them. Nobody's yelling now, kids, not while I'm here. Gideon's jaw tightened, and relief hid behind his stern face. Cole wiped the floor, and his anger grew quieter each stroke. Sadie helped him once, and she whispered, "Don't make trouble." Cole snapped back, and Sadie's shoulders dropped like beaten cloth. Claire noticed that, and she filed it away for later. Sadie's carrying too much, and she's only 10 years. Claire gave Sadie bread, and she called it a helper slice. Sadie smiled small, and she ate like someone ashamed. Claire said, "You're a child, Sadie, not the housemaid." Sadie blinked again, and she swallowed words she couldn't trust. Luke stayed near shadows, and he moved like a scared deer. Claire didn't chase him, and she left food near warmth. Luke returned later, and his bowl was empty by morning. Claire found a feather, and she set it in her Bible. Cole saw the feather, and he scoffed like it meant nothing. Claire kept stirring stew, and she didn't take the bait. She assigned chores, and she matched strength to each child. Cole hauled wood, and he did it like punishment work. Sadie washed dishes, and she did it like a prayer. Luke fed chickens, and he did it without meeting eyes. Annie and Sam swept, and they giggled when dust danced. Claire let them giggle, and the cabin felt less haunted. That afternoon, wind rose, and the ridge sounded like warning. Gideon checked traps, and he returned with rabbit for supper. Claire thanked him quietly, and he nodded once, like agreement. Cole watched their exchange, and jealousy flashed behind his scowl. He wanted Gideon's gaze, and he hated needing it. Claire caught that look, and she recognized lonely boy pride. At dusk, Cole vanished, and the chicken coop latch sat open. Feathers exploded inside, and Annie cried when birds scattered. Sadie ran after them, and Sam slipped in the mud. Claire moved fast, and she lifted Sam onto the porch. "Breathe with me, Sam," she said. "Count to 10. Sam sniffed hard, and his small chest finally slowed down. Claire turned to Cole, and her voice stayed level steel. "If you hurt them, Cole, you're hurting your own home." Cole glared back, and he clenched fists like he'd strike. Gideon stepped forward, and his shadow fell heavy on boards. Claire raised one hand, and she stopped Gideon without words. "Cole," she said, "look at Annie's face right now." Cole looked away, and shame fought hard against stubborn rage. Claire didn't preach, and she pointed toward the broken latch. "Fix it tonight, Cole, and you'll apologize at supper." Cole spat dirt, and he stalked out to the coop. Gideon stared at Claire, and respect crept into his eyes. He murmured, "You're brave, Claire." And she answered, "I'm tired." Night came early, and snow dusted the windows like ash. Claire read aloud, and the twins leaned into her skirt. Sadie sat close, and she stitched a torn sleeve quietly. Luke hovered near fire, and his hands carved a block. Cole stayed back, and he listened, though he wouldn't admit it. Claire read slower, and she chose words about storms and ships. Gideon cleaned his rifle, and he listened without looking up. When the children slept, Gideon spoke low by the hearth. "You're changing them, Claire, and I don't know how." Claire answered, "Steady, Gideon, I'm giving them safe patterns." Gideon nodded once, and his shoulders loosened like unknotted rope. Next morning, Cole returned, and he set split wood neatly. He didn't speak, and Claire pretended she didn't notice pride. Sadie hummed softly, and she stirred batter for cornbread. Claire praised her work, and Sadie's eyes shone briefly. Luke left a river stone, and Claire set it by lamp. Cole saw that stone, and he frowned like he'd lost ground. Claire assigned Cole to teach, and he scoffed at the idea. Teach Sam to stack wood, Cole, and do it patient. Cole tried once, and his temper rose like a match. Claire corrected him calmly, and she showed hands, not harshness. Cole watched her hands, and something old shifted inside him. That week, the cabin changed, and routines replaced raw grief. Still, Cole waited, and he searched for her breaking moment. Claire didn't break, and the ridge started trusting her quiet. One evening, wind turned purple, and clouds bruised the whole sky. Gideon sniffed the air, and he said, "A storm's coming." Claire glanced at Cole, and she saw fear under anger. Cole muttered, "Winter's early," and he tightened straps on boots. Claire checked rope coils, and she hung them by the door. Sadie asked why rope, and Claire said storms steal children fast. Luke went pale, and he held Annie's hand without thinking. Claire gathered them close and she taught one rule for blizzards. If you go outside, kids, you tie yourself to home. Cole stared at the rope, and he finally nodded, yes. Claire watched that nod, and she knew the war was shifting. The second day Gideon was gone, the sky turned bruised purple, and Claire felt the ridge tighten like a fist. Wind slammed the shutters, Sadie whispered prayers, and Cole stared outside, pretending he wasn't scared of blowing white darkness today. Claire checked the stove, counted wood, and said calm orders because panic spreads faster than cold in children. She sent Annie and Sam to blankets and told Sadie to keep Luke close, no matter what happened. Cole scoffed at her tone, yet he latched the barn and his hands moved quick like practiced duty. The temperature dropped hard and the daylight thinned, turning the yard into a gray bowl of spinning needles. Claire heard a bang and Cole shouted over the howl, the barn door's loose, and Luke ain't inside. Sadie cried. Luke was playing blocks. Then she saw the empty floor and her face went small with fear. Cole ran to the doorway and yelled the calf got out and Luke chased it. The idiot always does. Claire's stomach turned cold, yet her voice stayed firm because leaders can't borrow courage from tomorrow when winter arrives. She grabbed her wool coat, took the rope coil, and tied one end around her waist, knots tight and deliberate. Cole tried to block her, shouting, "You can't find him, you'll freeze," and Claire snapped, "Tie it now." She thrust the rope at him and pointed to the iron ring, saying, "You hold fast or we both die." Cole's eyes went wide, and he tied the rope with shaking fingers, then wrapped it around his own waist. Claire stepped into the storm and the wind stole her breath, pushing snow into her lashes until the world vanished. She leaned forward, feeling the rope tug behind her, and she crawled by memory toward the tree line and hollows. Claire shouted Luke's name, but the sound broke apart and she listened instead for any small cry beneath wind. Her gloves went stiff and her knuckles burned, yet she kept moving, because quitting would mean explaining death to twins. She found hoof prints, then smaller tracks, and she followed them in zigzags, counting steps to stay oriented. The rope jerked and she tugged twice, a signal to Cole, then pushed onward, shoulder first into drifts. A shadow moved near a pine and Claire spotted a tiny mitten blue against white like hope dropped careless. She fell to her knees, digging with gloved hands, and snow packed hard, refusing her like stubborn clay. Claire ripped off one glove and scraped faster, feeling pain spark, yet she didn't stop because Luke mattered. She uncovered Luke, curled tight arms around the calf, eyes half closed, lips pale, breathing shallow in freezing air. Claire pressed her cheek to his forehead and whispered, "I've got you," then wrapped him in her coat. Luke tried to speak, and only a thin sound came, so Claire held him closer, rocking once, like promise. She turned toward the cabin and tugged the rope hard, praying. Cole still held it, praying the knot survived. For a breath, the rope went slack and Claire's heart jumped. Then it snapped taut, pulling her back inchwise. Cole's voice cut through wind, rough and scared. "I'm coming," and a dark shape pushed into white toward her. Cole reached her and he grabbed Luke's shoulders, then he grabbed Claire's arm and his grip was iron. Claire yelled, "Keep low, keep moving," and Cole nodded, jaw clenched, hair crusted with snow, eyes fierce with guilt. They hauled together, dragging Luke between them, and the calf stumbled away, freed by the only mercy winter offered. Claire's legs shook and black edges crept into her vision, yet she focused on the cabin door like salvation. Cole tied the rope around his waist again and braced his boots, then pulled with full weight against the gale. Claire crawled, pushing Luke forward, and each shove felt like lifting stone, but she wouldn't let the boy slip. Sadie appeared at the doorway, screaming their names, and she held the door wide face, wet with melted snow. Annie and Sam clung behind her, and Claire shouted, "Shut your eyes," then shoved Luke inside the warm light. Cole fell in after them and kicked the door closed, sealing out the storm with one hard thud of wood. Claire collapsed on the floorboards, chest heaving, and Sadie threw blankets, hands trembling while she tried to be brave. Cole rubbed Luke's hands fast, whispering, "Breathe, little brother, breathe," and his voice cracked like split cedar. Luke coughed, then cried, and the sound filled the cabin, a living sound that made everyone start breathing again. Cole looked at Claire, really looked, and the anger in him broke, replaced by shock and grateful respect. "You saved him," Cole whispered, and Claire shook her head, saying, "We saved him because pride can't heal families." Cole's eyes brimmed and he wiped them hard, then he said "Ma" under his breath, like testing a word. Claire froze at that word, and warmth spread through her despite shivering because it landed where shame once lived. Outside, the storm screamed on, but inside the cabin a new order held, stitched by rope, fear, and choice. Claire stared at the fire and thought of Gideon returning, and she knew the mountain would never doubt her again. The blizzard eased by morning, but the ridge still groaned, and Claire's hands throbbed like cracked cedar and fire embers. Cole didn't apologize out loud, yet he stacked firewood without being asked, watching her rap knuckles with shame today quietly. Sadie patched the barn roof with hide strips while Luke sat near the hearth blinking at warmth he'd missed most. Annie and Sam carried small kindling, and they counted each stick because counting kept their fear from running wild again. Claire inspected shutters and latches, then taught the children signals on rope. 1, tug for danger. 2, safe. Always remember. When night fell, Cole sat closer than before and he listened as she read, pretending the words were air only. Claire chose a shipwrecked tale, and she paused on every brave decision, letting Cole hear courage without pride at all. Gideon returned on the third evening, snow crusted on his beard eyes, scanning the cabin like a battlefield inside first. He expected ruin and tears, but he smelled stew, saw swept boards, and saw Luke breathing steady by fire there. Cole took the supply bags from Gideon's hands, saying, "Pa, we had trouble," and his voice held respect now too. Gideon's gaze snapped to Claire, then to her bandaged fingers, and something softened behind his storm eyes at once more. He dropped to one knee and he took her hands gently, as if holding a candle against wind alone tonight. Claire didn't milk the moment. She simply said, "Luke's alive, and Cole pulled us home through whiteout with rope tight." Gideon looked at his son and he nodded once, a silent thanks that Cole received, like earned pay for life. Later, Gideon checked the barn damage and Cole followed him wordless, doing repairs instead of throwing anger around today anymore. Winter settled hard, and the ridge disappeared under deep snow, turning their world into cabin, barn, and trail alone together. Claire rationed flour, measured salt, and kept coffee for mornings when Gideon's shoulders sagged like wet canvas too much again. She taught Sadie to sew from sackcloth, and she praised small stitches because praise feeds hungry hearts so well. Luke began leaving tiny gifts, a river stone, a feather, a carved peg, each one saying, "I'm here with you." Cole still slept light, but he stopped sabotaging and he started splitting wood before Claire asked twice each. Cold dawn. One night, Claire's cough returned deep in her chest, and Gideon heard it like a gunshot in dark rooms nearby. He froze, remembering Nora's last winter, and fear made him rough, ordering the children to the main room right away. Claire tried to laugh it off, but her fever climbed and her skin burned while the wind screamed outside still. Gideon brewed willow bark tea, and he warmed snowmelt cloths, working with steady hands that once trapped wolves for food. He sat beside her bed, barely blinking, and he whispered, "Don't leave me, Claire. Not like that again this time." Claire felt his fear, and she squeezed his wrist, saying, "I'm stubborn, Gideon. I'm staying. You know it well already." When her fever broke, Gideon let out a breath, and he rested his forehead on her fingers in thanks quietly. He didn't speak of love like a poet, but his eyes said it, and Claire answered with a tired smile. Outside, Cole guarded the door at night, and he corrected the twins, gently copying Claire's steady tone for once too. Sadie watched her brother change, and she finally slept deeper, no longer bracing for shouting every evening at all there. By midwinter, the cabin felt warm, not just from fire, but from the way nobody feared footsteps in halls anymore. Claire kept Gideon's accounts in a small book, tracking pelts, flour, and nails, because survival is math, up here always. She asked about landlines one evening, and Gideon went quiet, saying, "Banks in town loved crooked paper most times." Claire nodded, remembering Harlan's grin, and she promised herself she'd read any document like a trap sign before stepping near. Spring felt far away, but the family was holding, and Gideon began planning a supply run down valley soon enough. Claire looked at the children asleep, and she understood her worth wasn't blood. It was chosen responsibility, daily, right here. She also understood men like Harlan never quit, and she warned Gideon Town trouble follows good land so fast often. Gideon listened, then he touched her shoulder, saying, "You're my partner, Claire, and I trust your sight more than mine." Claire smiled, and she poured him coffee, knowing the next trip to Red Lodge Valley would test them all hard. In the dark, the wind kept talking, yet inside that cabin, their names finally sounded like family, not rumor anymore. Cole woke early, and he asked Claire how to set a snare right, because he wanted to provide for once. Claire showed him careful loops, and she said, "Patience beats force." And Cole repeated the words under breath again later. Sadie learned to trade yarn for flour, and Claire taught her to look men in eyes, not down ever again. Luke started speaking in full sentences, slow at first, and Gideon listened like it was Sunday hymn to him alone. Annie and Sam stopped flinching at loud sounds, and they began laughing, the kind that fills walls with light fast. Gideon carved Claire a smoother rocker, and he set it by the hearth, saying, "You've earned rest here at last." Claire answered with a grin, but she kept working because love in the West is proved by chores every day. When the first thaw came, Gideon hitched the team, and Claire packed lists ready for town judgment again so soon. Cole checked rifle sights, then he stood beside Claire, not in front, and that choice meant everything to her too. They rolled downhill toward Red Lodge Valley, carrying pelts, and Hope, unaware a banker's paper waited like poison for them. They rolled into Red Lodge Valley mud, sucking at wheels. Claire sat tall beside Gideon, and Cole rode close. Sadie held Annie's mitten, and Sam bounced with wonder. Luke watched the storefronts, and his eyes stayed careful. Folks turned to stare because rumors don't die quietly. Mabel Pruitt froze mid-whisper, and her cheeks went pale. Mr. Kessler stepped outside, and his hands started shaking. He said, "Claire, you look alive," and he meant it. Claire smiled once, and she didn't offer the town mercy. Gideon unloaded pelts, and his silence warned every watcher. Cole scanned the street, and he stayed between trouble lines. Claire walked into the store, and the bell rang bright. Peppermint and leather hit her, and old shame tried returning. She breathed slow, and she told herself, "It won't win." Mr. Kessler asked for a list, and Claire gave it. 200 pounds flour, 50 sugar, 10 coffee beans today. Mabel dropped a calico bolt, and nobody laughed at her. Claire saw that, and she stored it like a receipt. Then the door swung open, and Harlan Whitcomb entered. He looked tired, and his suit couldn't hide jealousy. He saw Claire's coat, and he hated her glow. He stepped closer, and his voice turned soft and sharp. "Claire," he said, "it's a burden, raising feral children." Cole moved first, and his hand rested near knife. "You watch your mouth," he said. "That's my mother's name." Harlan flinched, and pride pushed him to keep talking. "Control your mongrel," he said, and Gideon stepped inside. The room went colder because Gideon's eyes never blinked. Harlan swallowed, and he tried to smile anyway. "There, you got words for my wife?" Gideon asked quietly. Harlan nodded, and he pulled folded paper from coat. He waved it once, and the seal caught sunlight hard. "This is business," he said, "and the bank owns River." He claimed old surveys, and he claimed fees for timber. He said $2,000, and he said foreclosure too. An old man coughed, and the store held its breath. Gideon clenched fists, and Claire saw the mountain waking. She touched his chest, and she said, "Gideon, not yet." Gideon stopped because her touch carried law and love. Claire stepped forward, and she held out her palm. "Let me see it, Harlan," she said without blinking. Harlan smirked, and he asked why a floor sweeper. Claire answered, "Because you want witnesses and you want shame." She said, "Give it here and let them see you." Harlan hesitated, and bullies hate mirrors in daylight. He handed it over, and his fingers brushed hers quick. Claire unfolded the paper, and she read like counting stock. She scanned corners, dates, and every mark men hide. Mabel leaned in, and her gossip turned into hunger. Cole watched Claire's face, and he saw no fear. Gideon watched too, and his respect settled deeper there. Claire tapped the date, and she looked up slowly. "You rushed this, Harlan," she said with a thin smile. Harlan scoffed, and he said, "It's sealed and binding." Claire nodded once, and she turned toward the whole room. She spoke clear, and her voice filled every shelf. "You all remember my broom," she said, "and my ledgers. You remember my silence, and you mistook it for weakness." She pointed at Mr. Kessler, and he nodded sadly. She said, "I read every notice, every dispatch that came." Harlan laughed again, and his laugh sounded less steady. Claire said, "You forget timing, and timing is everything." She said, "This survey date, it falls after a freeze." She didn't name governors, and she didn't recite long statutes. She said territory offices stopped crooked surveys because banks cheated. She said no ratified seal, then no claim stands. Harlan's smile cracked, and sweat formed near his temple. He reached for the paper, and Claire held it away. She said, "You brought this for shame, not for court." She said, "I'll ride to Helena if you insist." She said, "Judges hate predators who hunt families with ink." The store stayed silent, and even Mabel couldn't breathe. Cole moved behind Claire, and he stood like a guard. Gideon crossed arms, and his shadow covered Harlan's boots. Harlan looked around, and he found no friendly eyes. Mr. Kessler stared down, and he wouldn't back the banker. A rancher shook his head, and a miner muttered thief. Harlan tried bravado, and he said, "This isn't over." Claire answered, "It is here, and that's what matters." She folded the paper and she pressed it into Harlan. She said, "Walk out now and keep what's left." Harlan's jaw worked, and he couldn't find a smart word. He turned fast, and he shoved past Gideon in fear. The door slammed and the bell rang like a verdict. For a beat nobody moved, and then Cole exhaled hard. He whooped once, and joy broke through winter's last ice. He hugged Claire's waist, and the words slipped out. "Ma," he said, and Claire felt her chest fill. Sadie smiled wide, and Luke blinked tears into firelight. Annie clapped softly, and Sam laughed like a free boy. Claire looked at Gideon, and his eyes shone proud. Gideon pulled her close, and he kissed her steady. Mabel watched stunned, and her gossip finally ran dry. Claire lifted her chin, and she didn't need revenge. She needed her family, and she already had them. The store stayed quiet until boots moved and lungs returned. Claire held Gideon close, and the town watched in shame. Cole kept his chin high, and his eyes never blinked. Sadie squeezed Luke's hand, and the twins leaned together. Mr. Kessler cleared his throat and offered Claire honest respect. Mabel Pruitt stood frozen, and her gossip finally went hungry. Men who'd whispered before now stared down at their boots. Women who'd judged her womb now measured her spine instead. Claire felt old anger rise, and she let it pass. She didn't need revenge. She needed peace for her children. Gideon gathered the pelts and tied them like hard promises. Cole lifted the heaviest bundle and did it without show. Sadie helped the twins and kept them warm inside coats. Luke looked at Claire once and nodded like a vow. Claire bought flour and coffee and paid with steady hands. Mr. Kessler added extra salt and called it fair trade. Claire thanked him softly and meant it more than pride. Outside the store, wind carried whispers down the muddy street. Some folks muttered apology, and some avoided her gaze entirely. Claire stepped into sunlight and felt lighter than before today. Gideon hitched the team and checked straps with calm care. Cole climbed beside the wagon and kept watch like sheriff. Mabel lingered near the door and couldn't form any words. Claire met her eyes and nodded once, without cruelty. That small nod said enough, and Mabel looked away, shaking. Across the street, the bank windows glinted like eyes behind glass. Claire knew Harlan would rage, and she stayed ready anyway. Gideon didn't ask questions because he trusted her judgment now. He only said good work, and his voice sounded proud. Claire answered, "We ain't done," and Gideon nodded grimly. They rolled out of town, and wheels sang through wet ruts. Cole glanced back once and saw faces change behind them. Sadie whispered, "Thank you, Claire," and Claire squeezed her shoulder. Luke held Annie's mitten, and Sam hummed a brave tune. The valley looked smaller now, and the ridge felt closer. Gideon drove steady and kept the horses from slipping. Claire watched clouds build and read weather like a ledger. Cole asked if Harlan would follow, and Gideon said maybe. Claire said if he does, we'll answer with truth again. Cole smiled a little, and that smile surprised his own face. When they camped that night, firelight made a small circle. Gideon brewed coffee and poured Claire the first cup. That first cup mattered because it was public respect now. Claire warmed her hands and felt bandages loosen slightly. Cole sat across the flames and stared into glowing coals. He said "Ma" again quietly, and Claire didn't correct him. Sadie pretended not to hear, and her grin gave her away. Luke set a carved peg down and slid it toward Claire. Claire took the peg gently and tucked it in her pocket. Annie and Sam fell asleep early and slept without nightmares. Gideon watched them breathe, and his eyes softened at last. Claire leaned beside him and listened to the dark woods. She said the town tried breaking me, and it failed. Gideon said they were fools, and he meant every word. Claire asked about river lines, and Gideon explained the ridge. He spoke of timber rights and old markers cut in stone. Claire listened closely and pictured every bend of that water. She said paper lies often and mountains rarely do. Gideon chuckled once, and that sound felt like spring. Cole asked how Claire learned ledgers, and Claire told him truth. She said survival needs numbers, and numbers can beat guns. Cole nodded slow and stored that lesson deep inside. Next morning they climbed, and the pass tested the wagon. Mud turned to ice, and the horses snorted through effort. Gideon walked beside them and guided each careful step. Claire held the brake rope and kept the wheels steady. Cole helped push uphill and never complained about strain. Sadie sang to the twins and kept their spirits warm. Luke watched the tree line and pointed when tracks crossed snow. Claire praised his sharp eyes and Luke stood a little taller. By late day, pines thickened and the ridge greeted them. Smoke rose from their chimney and it felt like home. Cole ran ahead and opened the barn with practiced pride. He checked latches twice and fixed what the storm loosened. Claire stepped into the cabin and smelled clean wood smoke again. Sadie hurried to the pantry and counted supplies like Claire taught. Luke fed the chickens and spoke 2 full sentences softly. Annie and Sam giggled and chased each other around chairs. Gideon set down the flour and looked at Claire quietly. He said, "You saved us twice, once from cold and shame." Claire answered, "We saved us," and Gideon accepted that truth. That evening, Gideon carved fresh pegs and repaired a broken shelf. Claire wrote in the ledger and logged supplies with care. Cole watched her writing and asked to learn the numbers. Claire slid him the pencil and said, "Start with tally marks." Cole tried hard and his tongue stuck out in focus. Sadie laughed softly, and the cabin filled with gentle noise. Mabel's voice couldn't reach them here, and neither could Harlan. Still, Claire kept a place ready for trouble to return. She hung the rope by the door and checked it nightly. Gideon noticed the rope and nodded like shared agreement. Winter wasn't done, but their family stood stronger than winter. Claire looked at the children and felt her heart settle. She whispered to the fire, "We belong here now." Spring came slow and the creek sang under crusted snow again today. Claire felt lighter, yet her bones still remembered winter's long teeth well. Gideon watched the thaw and he planned the supply run carefully. Cole checked harness leather and he spoke softer than last season. Sadie packed flour sacks and she counted each cup like treasure. Luke carried coffee beans and he smiled when nobody teased him. Annie and Sam chased sunbeams and they laughed at melting icicles. Claire wrote totals and her pencil moved steady as a metronome. She noticed strange fatigue and she blamed it on hard work. Bacon sizzled one morning, and the smell turned her stomach suddenly. Claire stepped outside and cold air helped her breathe again slowly. Gideon followed quietly and his eyes narrowed with old fear returning. He asked if she was sick and she said it was nothing. Claire tried smiling, yet her hands trembled while tying apron strings. Gideon remembered Nora's coughing, and that memory sat heavy inside him. He touched Claire's cheek and he felt heat that shouldn't be there. Claire insisted she was fine, but her voice didn't convince Gideon. That night he stayed awake and he listened to her breathing closely. The wind howled outside and Gideon heard a warning in it. He decided at dawn and he hitched the fastest team quickly. Claire protested softly, yet she climbed into the sleigh beside him. Cole wanted to come, but Gideon ordered him to guard home. Sadie hugged Claire hard, and she whispered, "Come back safe, please." Luke handed Claire his river stone, and Claire tucked it inside. Annie and Sam cried loudly, and Cole promised they'll be brave today. Gideon drove hard, and the runners hissed over packed snow fiercely. They bypassed Red Lodge Valley, and Claire felt the town's pull. Gideon kept his jaw tight, and he watched the trail ahead. Billings rose from the plain, and it smelled like coal smoke. Claire felt small there, yet she kept her chin lifted high. Gideon asked for Dr. Alden Price, and he wouldn't accept delays. A nurse stared at Gideon, and she hurried them into rooms. The clinic felt bright, and Claire hated its clean sharpness today. Dr. Price greeted them, and his eyes held calm experience inside. Claire gripped Gideon's hand, and her knuckles turned white in silence. "Tell me plain, doctor," she said, "is the fever back again?" Dr. Price asked questions, and Claire answered with steady frontier honesty. He asked about Dr. Pettigrew, and Claire named him with bitterness. Dr. Price sighed softly, and he said, "Frontier medicine can bruise souls." Gideon leaned forward, and he demanded truth without pretty words today. Dr. Price examined Claire, and he listened to her heart carefully. Claire stared at the wall, and she prayed without church language. Gideon's boot tapped once, and the sound filled the quiet room. Dr. Price removed spectacles, and he smiled like sunrise after storms. "Mrs. Cross," he said, "there is nothing wrong with you today." Claire blinked hard, and she felt her breath catch mid-chest. Gideon whispered, "Then what?" and his voice cracked around the words. Dr. Price spoke gently, and he said, "She's about 4 months pregnant." The room went silent, and Claire thought she misheard him completely. "Pregnant," she whispered, "but they said I was broken soil forever." Gideon went pale, and his shoulders shook with held-back grief. He dropped to his knees, and he pressed his face to her. Claire stroked his hair, and she laughed through tears of disbelief. Dr. Price nodded kindly and he explained healing takes time sometimes. He said mountain air helps and low stress restores body rhythms. Claire remembered whispers and she felt them crumble like dry mud. Gideon stood slowly and he kissed her knuckles with reverence today. He said, "I'm sorry, Claire. I doubted hope like a fool." Claire answered, "You didn't, Gideon. You protected us when hope hurt." They left the clinic and sunlight seemed brighter than ever before. Gideon bought supplies and he carried them like sacred offerings home. On the trail back, Claire rode quiet, listening to new life. She placed a palm low and she felt nothing yet inside. Gideon kept glancing over and his eyes shone with awe. He said Nora would understand. And Claire nodded with respectful silence. They reached the ridge, and Cole saw their faces at once. Sadie ran to Claire, and she searched her for bad news. Claire smiled wide, and she said, "We're having a baby soon." Cole froze stiff, then he turned away to hide watery eyes. Luke clapped once softly, and Annie and Sam squealed with wild joy. Gideon lifted Cole's chin, and he said, "This changes nothing, son." Cole swallowed hard, and he whispered, "It changes everything, good Pa." Claire watched that moment, and her heart felt big as sky. Summer came fast, and Claire's belly rounded under simple dresses. Sadie sewed her clothes, and she stitched pride into every seam. Luke carved a cradle, and his hands worked steady and sure. Cole built a safer pen, and he fixed nails without complaint. Annie and Sam gathered flowers, and they placed them by Claire's bed. Gideon cut extra wood, and he stored it like winter insurance. Claire ate well, and she rested more without feeling lazy inside. Some nights fear returned, and Gideon held her hand tighter then. He said, "We're ready, Claire," and he meant the whole family. When labor came, Gideon rode for the midwife with frantic speed. Cole boiled water, and Sadie kept twins quiet with stories tonight. Claire breathed through pain, and she focused on Gideon's steady voice. The baby cried at dawn, and that sound filled the cabin. A healthy boy arrived, and Claire laughed with exhausted relief today. They named him Thomas, and Gideon said the name with pride. Cole held Thomas gently, and his tough mask melted away. Luke smiled wide, and Sadie wiped tears from her cheeks. Annie and Sam danced circles, and Gideon laughed like a boy. Claire rocked in her chair, and she watched 6 hearts together. She whispered, "Family is chosen," and the mountain seemed to agree. Years later, folks in Red Lodge Valley would still talk about the winter the ridge refused to bury. They would talk about Gideon Cross like he was carved from pine and stone. They would talk about the 5 wild children who came down the mountain looking like little ghosts. But the name that stayed on tongues the longest was Claire. Not because she was gentle, because she was steady. The valley had tried to turn her into a warning. A woman without children, a woman without purpose, a woman without worth. That lie is older than the West, and it travels farther than any wagon trail. It moves through churches, through kitchens, through polite smiles that hide sharp teeth. And in 1884 Montana, it moved like law. Claire learned something hard on that boardwalk outside Mr. Kessler's store. People will call you broken when they want to feel whole. They will call you useless when they want to avoid their own fear. They will point at your wound, then tell themselves it could never happen to them. That is how small towns stay comfortable and how good people become cruel. Gideon did not fix the town. He did not lecture the valley into kindness. He did not drag a preacher into the street and demand a better sermon. He simply looked at Claire and saw a survivor where the town saw a failure. He heard the gossip and decided it was noise. He needed a partner, and he chose the one person who had already lived through fire. Up on that ridge, the mountains did not care about reputations. Snow did not care about opinions. Hunger did not care about church talk. The bitter cold only asked one question: "Are you ready, or are you dead?" Claire answered that question with routines and quiet authority. She did not demand love from children who were still holding funerals in their chests. She demanded clean hands, dry boots, and respect inside the cabin. She demanded that fear stop running the house. She demanded that grief stop turning into chaos. And she did it without shouting, because shouting is what people do when they are losing. Cole was the hardest part, and that made sense. A 13-year-old boy with a rifle is not a villain. He is a son trying to stand where a mother used to stand. He is a child trying to build a wall high enough to keep pain out. Cole did not hate Claire because she was cruel. He hated her because he was terrified she would leave too. So he pushed. He sabotaged. He tried to make her quit before his heart could hope. Claire did not quit. And that is what broke the war. Not a speech, not a slap, not a prayer shouted into the wind. A woman who kept showing up. A woman who kept feeding the smallest ones first. A woman who kept doing the next right thing even when nobody clapped. Then the blizzard came and the mountain asked its real question. When the storm takes a child who goes into the whiteout. Claire did. Not because she was fearless. Because she could not live with letting a boy die for a calf and a mistake. She tied herself to home with rope, and she walked into the roaring dark. That is not romance. That is motherhood. It is not blood. It is a decision. Cole saw it with his own eyes. He felt the rope burn in his hands. He watched Claire come back with Luke in her arms, and in that moment the word Ma slipped out of him like truth. That word did not erase Nora. It did not replace a grave under a willow. It simply made room for a living woman who had earned a place by action. Gideon saw it too, and he did something men do only when they trust the ground under their boots. He let someone else share the load. He let a partner stand beside him. He let love grow in the quiet spaces between chores, coffee, and the sound of children breathing safely. When they rode down to town, the valley expected the old story. They expected Claire to come back tired, thinner, ashamed, and ready to be pitied again. They expected Gideon to be broke, angry, and one bad day away from violence. They expected Cole to be feral, dangerous, and ready to cause trouble. They were wrong about all of it. Harlan Whitcomb brought his paper because he believed the old lie. He believed Gideon was just muscle. He believed Claire was still the woman with a broom and bowed head. He thought ink could take what winter could not. He thought shame was a leash, and he wanted an audience, because predators love witnesses. Claire took his paper, and she did not drown the room in fancy law. She did something far more powerful. She read him. She named his hunger. She pointed at his carelessness. She reminded the town that a woman who kept ledgers for years knows how men cheat. She made the valley watch a bully lose control. She made them see the difference between authority and arrogance. Cole whooped. The store went silent. Mabel Pruitt ran out of breath for the first time in her life. And Gideon kissed Claire like a man thanking God without needing a hymn. After that day, the story did not end with applause. Life on the frontier never ends with applause. It ends with more work, more wood to split, more storms to respect, more mouths to feed. But something had changed for good. The family believed in itself. Claire kept the accounts, and Gideon kept the ridge safe. Cole learned to lead with patience because he had watched Claire do it first. Sadie learned she was not born to carry everyone because Claire finally let her be 10. Luke learned his voice mattered because nobody laughed when he spoke. Annie and Sam learned the world can be loud without being dangerous. And the cabin once wounded became a home that held laughter the way it held heat. Then came the twist that felt like the West itself playing a joke on every cruel mouth in town. Claire became pregnant. Not because fate wanted to prove gossip wrong, not because God needed to punish Mabel for talking too much, because bodies heal, because time passes, because a woman in clean air, with steady food, with less stress, can find her strength again, and because no frontier doctor gets to write the last chapter for a woman he barely knows. When Thomas was born, Gideon cried like a man who had been holding a river behind his ribs. Cole held the baby with hands that used to grip a rifle. Sadie smiled until her cheeks hurt. Luke looked at tiny fingers like he was seeing a miracle built from ordinary love. Annie and Sam danced, and the ridge felt lighter than it had in years. Claire rocked in the chair Gideon carved, and she understood something that would have saved her younger self a lot of pain. A legacy is not just blood. A legacy is who you keep alive when the storm shows its teeth. A legacy is who you defend when the town wants a scapegoat. A legacy is who you choose every day when it would be easier to walk away. If you are watching this with a little more gray in your beard than you used to have, you already know the world changes fast. Bodies change fast too. Breath gets shorter if you let years steal it. So I will ask you the same thing I asked at the start. How is your breathing these days, steady, or does the smallest hill make you work for it? And here is the question I want to leave you with, the one that sticks like pine resin. If you were Gideon, would you have trusted a woman the town called barren? If you were Claire, would you have walked into that whiteout for a child who was not yours by blood? And if you were Cole, would you have had the courage to let a new kind of love into a house, still grieving? Because that is the truth the West never stops teaching. Family is not just born, family is built. And the people worth riding with are the ones who build it, even when the wind says you cannot.